Good morning, everyone. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the joint meeting of the City of Carlsbad's Council and Planning Commission. Today we will be receiving a staff report on the proposed update to the general plan, the climate action plan, associated amendments, and the program environmental report. And we will hear testimony on these documents. I will now call the City Council meeting to order and the public meeting hearing. Madam Clerk, please take roll.
Councilmember Packard?
Here.
Councilmember Wood? Here. Councilmember Schumacher?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Blackburn?
Present.
Mayor Hall?
Here.
My apologies, some of these mics are
We now adjourn the City Council meeting and reconvene to the joint meeting of the City Council and the Planning Commission. Chairperson Scully, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Chairperson Scully, this is your line.
That's your cue.
Yes, you do. Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, City Council. We will now take roll for the Planning Commission meeting and open public hearing. I will begin by taking roll. Commissioner Carrie Siekman. Here. Commissioner Jeff Siegel.
Here.
Commissioner Marty Montgomery.
Here.
Commissioner Hap LaRue.
Here.
Commissioner Neil Black.
Here.
I see Commissioner Anderson is not here. And Commissioner Victoria Scully is here. We will now adjourn the Planning Commission meeting and reconvene to the joint meeting of the City Council. I will defer to the Mayor and the Chair of the joint meeting.
Thank you. With that, if we could all please rise, and Council Member Wood will lead us in the pledge.
Excuse me, Mr. Mayor, before we begin, I would like to make note that Commissioner Anderson is here.
Thank you. Today we will hear the staff presentation on the proposed comprehensive updates to the City General Plan, which includes an update to the housing element for the 2013 through 2020 housing plan period. For consistency with the General Plan's updated land use, the mobility policies, amendments are also proposed to the zoning ordinance, the zoning map, the local coastal program, and the land use and zoning maps, and the growth management plan. Circulation performance standards. In addition, a climate action plan is proposed, and the program environmental impact report has been prepared for this project. We are having this joint meeting of the City Council and the Planning Commission in order to provide an opportunity for both the City Council and the Planning Commission to hear the staff presentation and all public testimony on the proposed project at this time. Our hope is that the process will allow for greater efficiency, since both bodies will hear the same information in all public testimony. After the responses to public comments have been heard, the City Council will adjourn. The Planning Commission will continue with questions, discussions, deliberation, and make a recommendation to the City Council regarding the certification of the final environmental impact report and approval of this project. Once the Planning Commission recommendations have been finalized in writing, the City Council will hold a final notice public hearing to consider those recommendations and to take action on certification of environmental impact report and the various components of the project. Public testimony at the later City Council meetings will be limited to revisions to the final environmental impact report or to the project which occur as a result of the Planning Commission's recommendations. I'm pleased to see such a large crowd today. The general plan and the related amendments that we are reviewing today are important in the direction of the city's future. Preparing these documents has been arduous task for city staff and has launched efforts from the city departments as well as outside consultants, and most importantly, input from the multiple community outreach events. And thinking about that over the last few years, that has probably touched over 8,000 people in this community. So this isn't something that's been done in a day. It's something that we've taken quite a bit of time to review. It's important for the City Council and the Planning Commission to hear the staff presentation and all public testimony, as we have a lot of speakers who wish to provide us with input on this project. I want to go over a few of the procedures which should help the meeting progress efficiently so that we have time to get through all of our speakers. First, I would ask the members of both bodies, hold your questions of staff until after we've completed all of the public testimony and staff responds to the commentary. So with that, I just hope that we all take good notes, and so we can, at the proper time, be able to ask our questions. If time does not permit us to get through the council and the commissioners' questions, those can be asked and answered at a future meeting of the respectful bodies. Next, we will be taking periodic 5-minute breaks throughout the day, as well as a 20-minute break for lunch. And please feel free, that's the 12 of us, if you need to take a break, please feel free to do so. I will resume the meeting promptly after each allotted break so that we can resume the hearing without unnecessary delays. So now I've done what the city attorney has asked me to do, but in honesty, ladies and gentlemen, today is your day. It's for us to be able to hear each and every one of you. It's to be respectful of everyone's thoughts and beliefs, and we want to give you as much time as possible. So staff is probably going to take about an hour and a half, and that's an approximate number, to go through their presentation. And one of the things that we would like to offer, and I'm saying it at this moment in time so you can think about it, there might be more than one of you, perhaps groups of 5 or more, who want to talk on a particular subject. If you would like to be able to give your time to one speaker, which means 5 or more people would be represented by this speaker, we will give you 10 minutes to speak so you can get into a little bit more detail. So with that, Kathy, if you want to introduce your staff.
Thank you, Mayor. And for our presentation this morning, I would like to introduce our Planning Director, Don New, Senior Planner, Dave DeCordova, and Planner Jennifer Jesser to make the staff presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Dodson, and good morning, Mayor and Council members, Chairperson Scully, and Planning Commissioners. We're very pleased to be here today. As mentioned in the Mayor's remarks, this has been a long journey, and this is a very significant milestone in that journey to end up with a updated general plan. As mentioned this morning, the staff presentation will be completed by myself, Principal Planner Dave DeCordova, and Senior Planner Jennifer Jesser. We've had a lot of staff, both from within the Planning Division and multiple city departments, that have provided great assistance on this project over a number of years. Also like to acknowledge our consultant team with our lead consultant, Rajiv Bhatia of Diet and Bhatia. Brian Grover is also here today from Dudek, and Chris Gray from Fair and Pierce. As the start of our presentation, I'd like to go over some of the main components, and the Mayor did mention some of these, but this graphic is to show you how these components relate to one another. So before both bodies, there are a number of items for your consideration, the first being Project EIR. And the EIR looks at an impact analysis of all the issues related to implementing the general plan goals and policies. It also contains the comment letters provided by members of the public and other organizations and other agencies, and provides detailed responses to all of those comments. And then other parts that are related to the CEQA action include a findings of fact and statement of overriding considerations, which we'll talk about later in the presentation, as well as the mitigation monitoring reporting program. Of course, the main element of our discussion is the updated general plan, which includes 9 elements. There is an amendment to the land use map and a related amendment to the zoning map. We also have some limited changes to the city's municipal code or zoning code, and then some of these items will require a local coastal program amendment. These are primarily the land use mapping changes and the municipal code changes. We also have the significant action in that this is the city's first climate action plan, so that is one of the items that you are considering. And then lastly, we have 2 growth management related actions, one being an amendment to the circulation performance standard, which is one of the 11 growth management facilities. And lastly, a request for an allocation of excess dwelling units under City Council Policy 43. So we did want to give you a roadmap of what our presentation will cover today. Obviously, there's a lot of information. We don't intend to go through each and every part of it, but we have picked a number of items that we intend to highlight as being some of the more significant and items that we have received a lot of interest in throughout the project's ongoing process. So we will spend some time today going over the land use designation changes as part of the general plan, as well as an overview of some of the changes to the existing and new elements. We will spend some time on the housing element as it relates particularly to the sites and our requirement to satisfy our regional housing share. And then we will also focus on the mobility element, as that contains some new policy direction different than what we have seen in former elements. As I mentioned, we'll also take you through the climate action plan and give you a brief overview of the environmental impact report and its findings. When we look back at why we were initiating a general plan update, we had to look at where the city had been and where things were headed. And if we consider from the birth of the city in the 1950s through approximately 2004, we had a significant period of growth and development. One of the factors that was key in that period was the 1986 Growth Management Program. So as the council and the commission's aware, we've had a number of major developments over this period of time. The growth management plan helped us manage a rapidly growing community and provide necessary infrastructure concurrent with that growth. And it also helped us preserve what we feel is a high quality of life for the community. Looking forward with the new update, we feel that, of course, the city's greenfield or undeveloped areas will transition to development areas in some cases while still respecting our open space requirements, but that other issues emerge, and these are things like infill development and redevelopment, focus on more pedestrian-friendly design, participation with other organizations and partnerships with other groups, also a focus on energy efficiency and low emission factors that you'll find in the climate action plan. And then lastly, of course, making sure that we sustain and enhance the quality of life in the community. So when we started the project in approximately 2008, we did go through an extensive community outreach period, and what that resulted in was a community vision and a preferred land use plan. The council did appoint a citizens committee to help guide us, and that was the Envision Carlsbad Citizens Committee. That group met 18 times over the course of 3.5 years. We had 4 community workshops on the proposed vision, as well as 2 community workshops on land use alternatives. We had a special workshop focused on the Barrio neighborhood and an additional focused workshop on the climate action plan. We conducted 2 citywide surveys, and we also held stakeholder interviews related to the vision with over 80 organizations participating. We did have stakeholder forums for the draft general plan and the preferred land use plan, and these included developers, housing stakeholders, as well as our planning commission. The council did accept the community vision in January of 2010. The community vision is the foundation for the general plan update, and I think we're all very familiar with the 9 core values in the vision that have been used since its adoption to guide other city actions. So we then focused our efforts on how to translate the vision into land use. So the general plan process, we did look at 3 land use concepts. These were one titled the active waterfront, the core focus area, and centers. We held 2 community workshops and a survey to identify the community's land use preferences. And based on this community feedback, the EC3, or the Envision Carlsbad Citizens Committee, and the Planning Commission made a recommendation on a preferred land use plan. And then in September 2012, the City Council endorsed a preferred land use plan for use in the preparation of the general plan update. And so that was our foundation for starting the analysis needed for the environmental impact report, as well as how we might satisfy some of the other needs and requirements. We did have, as we've mentioned, several opportunities for public review of documents as those were prepared to implement these various actions. So the first being the draft general plan was available in February of 2014 for public review. That was followed by the draft climate action plan in April of the same year. And then the EIR was also available in April, and we had a 60-day review period. And then later this year in March, we recirculated 2 portions of the EIR for public review. At this time, we're going to go into the draft general plan, and I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer Jesser for that portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Don. So for my part of the presentation, I'm going to focus on providing the Commission and Council with a very high-level overview of what is in the general plan, what do the elements contain. And then we're going to focus our presentation on 3 key topics related to the general plan elements, and those consist of the land use designation changes that are proposed, the housing element update, as well as the mobility element. So, as most of you know, our general plan is required by state law. All jurisdictions in the state of California are required to have a general plan, and the purpose of a general plan is to provide a vision for long-term development and enhancement of the community, and to provide goals and policies that will guide the city toward attaining that vision. Our proposed general plan has a planning horizon of 2035, so the goals and policies contained in the draft general plan will guide the city toward its vision toward the year 2035. As Don mentioned, our general plan is structured to achieve the community's vision. It also is structured to comply with all applicable laws and requirements. And in the beginning of each element chapter, there's a section that describes how that element relates to state law, and another section that describes how it relates to the community's vision. And in the first chapter of the general plan, you'll find that the community's vision is incorporated into the general plan in its entirety. And there's a section that describes what the key strategies of the general plan are, which relate back directly to the core values. Those strategies are to achieve an active waterfront, to provide accessible and walkable centers throughout the community, to reinforce the city's employment core, and to continue the city's strong commitment to providing open space. Other strategies include creating livable streets, revitalizing older neighborhoods, and maintaining consistency with the city's growth management plan. So when you look through the goals and policies of each of the elements, you'll see that those strategies are reflected through the goals and policies. So in the interest of time, I can't go through each and every element in the general plan. This slide shows the titles of each of the primary elements. And state law requires that a general plan address 7 mandatory topics or mandatory elements. Our draft general plan does address those mandatory topics. On the screen, you'll see at the end of each title there's an M or an O that indicates either mandatory or optional. Some of our elements are both mandatory and optional. An example is our land use and community design element. The land use component is a mandatory topic required by state law. The community design component of that element is an optional topic, but because that is an important value in the community, we have provided goals and policies to address that value. I'll give you just a brief description of the purpose of each of these elements. The land use and community design element is intended to direct the location and form and character of future development throughout the community. The mobility element is intended to create a livable street system that provides for the mobility needs of all users of the street system, including vehicles, pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit users. The open space and conservation element is intended to provide a framework to address open space needs for natural resource conservation, as well as the open space needs for parks and recreation facilities. This element also provides policies related to beaches, trails, agricultural resources, and the environmental topics of air and water quality. Our noise element controls the effect of noise on our daily life by establishing acceptable noise thresholds for the various land uses throughout the community. Public safety element acknowledges and is intended to reduce the risks that are proposed by both natural and man-made threats or hazards, such as flooding, geologic and seismic hazards, airport hazards, hazardous materials, as well as crime and fire hazards. Our arts, history, culture, and education element is intended to preserve and enhance our cultural resources, to promote the visual and performing arts in the community, and to support lifelong learning. And the topic of education in this element is something new that's not currently in our general plan, and it links back to the community value that was identified for lifelong learning. The economy, business, diversity, and tourism element, this is a brand new element. We currently don't have this element in the general plan. It also links back to the community values. And it is intended to outline the city's economic development objectives and ensures that economic decision-making is integrated with other aspects of development in the city. The sustainability element is also a new topic in the general plan, linking back to our community values, and provides an overarching framework for sustainability regarding greenhouse gas reduction, it also addresses water conservation, green building standards, sustainable energy, and sustainable food in the community. And our last element is the housing element, which plans for and identifies how to meet the community's housing needs. And this is an element that we'll provide a little more detail on later in the presentation. That was a very high-level overview of what's contained in the general plan, but for more information, the staff report does provide some good summaries of the general plan elements. Attachment 5 of the staff report summarizes each of the elements, highlighting what is new. Attachment 6 summarizes our housing element, and Attachment 7 provides a comparison of the proposed goals and policies compared to our existing goals and policies. And now I'd like to focus your attention on our proposed land use designation changes. In attachment 8 of the staff report, there's a good description and analysis of all of the land use designation changes proposed. And you'll see in that attachment 8 that we divide them into 2 categories. Category 1 consists of sites that were identified on the preferred land use plan. These are land use changes that are intended to align with the core values of the community vision and also to satisfy the city's housing obligations per state law. And as I mentioned, we'll provide a better overview of the housing element and the requirements for housing per state housing law in a little later in the presentation. The Category 2 land use changes consist of what we refer to as mapping cleanup. We've identified throughout the city where our general plan land use map and our zoning map provide inconsistent designations on some properties. We identified all of these inconsistencies and are recommending map changes to ensure that the maps are consistent. Our objective and our focus when evaluating these inconsistencies was to ensure that any change we made to the land use map or zoning map would not be inconsistent with existing uses of the ground on the ground. So these changes align with existing uses and do not create any nonconformities. So these Category 2 changes do not represent land use changes. They're simply map cleanup. All of the proposed map changes are reflected in map books that are part of the staff report, which provide a visual of each of the proposed changes at a parcel level, so you can see what is existing and what is proposed. All of the property owners affected by both the Category 1 and the Category 2 map changes were notified last April. We sent out an individual notice to each property owner. On the screen is an example of the diagram that was included with the notice, identifying what change was proposed on their property. This notice did generate a significant response, and as a result of the property owner comments and concerns that we heard, staff did revise or withdraw some of the proposed changes. And the revised changes are reflected in the map books and on the recommended land use and zoning maps. I would now like to focus on the Category 1 changes, which represent the proposed land use changes. You'll see on the screen, this is a diagram of the preferred land use plan that was recommended by the Planning Commission and approved by the City Council. There are 6 sites on this exhibit that the Council added to the Planning Commission's recommended preferred land use plan. These were added for evaluation purposes as part of our general plan update. So staff did evaluate those sites as well as all of the others shown on this exhibit. And you'll see that the sites we evaluated included both residential land use designation changes and non-residential land use changes. This exhibit shows the non-residential changes. The sites that are circled in green are the sites that the non-residential land use designations that staff recommends approval of. You'll see there are 2 sites that staff does not recommend approval of, and that's because we received letters from the property owners requesting that those land use changes be withdrawn from consideration. So staff is not recommending approval of those 2. Those are the Oaks North office property and the EWA property. You'll also see that probably one of the most significant of the changes of the non-residential is at the Encina Power Plant. The property of the existing power plant west of the site is identified. The majority of that land west of the railroad tracks is to be designated for future tourist serving commercial, visitor commercial, and open space uses. So when that site redevelops at some point in the future, the land use designation will indicate what the intended future use would be. Now, regarding the residential land use changes that we evaluated, this exhibit shows each of the sites. So there's yellow and various shades of brown. Those are the sites that residential changes that we evaluated. And they consist of 3 of our residential density ranges. 3 sites were evaluated at the R15 density. That's the Marja site and the Sunny Creek RLM 6 and RLM 8 properties. 2 properties were also evaluated at the R23 density range. That is the Sunny Creek commercial property and the La Costa Town Square property. The remainder of those properties were evaluated at the R30 density range. And I'd like to note that as part of our analysis and evaluation, we evaluated these properties at the growth control point density point. So all of our analysis and dwelling unit projections were based on this density. Development is not allowed to build above that density without a discretionary action by the city. So the growth control point density is the density that development can build to without further discretionary approval. Now, these Category 1 residential land use changes, the city can't approve them all. So the staff is asking the commission and the council to make some choices amongst these properties. And there are a couple reasons why the city cannot approve all of them. One relates to the growth management dwelling unit limit in each of the city's 4 quadrants. So for the most part, the proposed land use changes are within the growth management dwelling limits, with the exception of the northeast quadrant. With all of the sites that we evaluated in the northeast quadrant, if they were all approved, there is the potential that development in that quadrant would exceed the growth caps by almost 800 units. So right away, we know that we cannot approve all of those properties, and staff has evaluated them to ensure that we maintain consistency with the growth management dwelling limits in all 4 quadrants. The second reason we cannot approve all of them is related to our excess dwelling unit bank and the number of units available to authorize these land use changes, and I'll talk to that in a little bit. To help us evaluate these sites and make recommendations on which sites may be more preferable for residential development than others, staff used 4 different criteria. The first criteria was, would the density that was evaluated assist the city in achieving its housing element goals? And we'll talk about those housing element goals a little later in the presentation. Another criteria was the site's proximity to neighborhood services like shopping, employment, parks, and schools that would serve residences. We also evaluated whether or not there were significant compatibility issues with surrounding land uses. And also, in approving the land use change, would the city lose employment land? That was another consideration. So we used that criteria first in evaluating the sites in the northeast quadrant. Our first focus was that quadrant to ensure that the sites would not exceed the growth management control point or the growth management dwelling limit for that quadrant. And after evaluating each of the properties that we evaluated, staff is recommending approval of 3 residential land use changes. One is the Basin BJ property. We recommend being designated at the R30 density range. The other is the Robertson Ranch, Planning Area 22. We also recommend the R30 density range on that property. The third area is the Sunny Creek commercial property, which staff recommends designating a portion of the property at the R23 density range, and a smaller portion would remain for a local shopping center. Regarding the Sunny Creek commercial site, what we evaluated, staff is recommending something a little different than what was evaluated. This property is approximately 17 and a half acre site that is currently designated to develop as a local shopping center. We evaluated that 11 and a half acres would be designated for multifamily residential use, the remaining 6 acres for local shopping center. Staff is recommending that a minimum of 8 acres be retained for a local shopping center on the property, which is a provision in our current general plan and the draft general plan, which requires a minimum of 8 acres for a local shopping center. The remainder of the site, approximately 9.5 acres, would then be developed with the R23 multifamily residential designation, which would allow for approximately 182 dwelling units on that R23 portion. So with staff's recommendation on the 3 sites in the northeast quadrant, development in that quadrant would be within the growth management dwelling limits for the quadrant. This exhibit shows those 3 sites recommended in the northeast quadrant, as well as all of the other residential properties that we evaluated throughout the rest of the city. With all of these sites considered, the number of units that would need to be allocated from the excess dwelling unit bank to authorize these land use changes to occur would be 1,376 units. This slide shows that the current excess dwelling unit bank balance is 1,659 units. However, the city reserves a good chunk of that for the village. We've reserved 768 units in the bank for use in the village. So future residential development in the village requires a withdrawal from the bank, and we reserve units for that purpose. That leaves 891 units in the excess dwelling unit bank that the city can use outside of the village to authorize increases in density, redesignating properties from non-residential to residential. And that's the number of units we have to authorize these proposed land use changes, which is not enough to authorize all of the sites evaluated. Now, another source of excess dwelling units will be generated by the Category 2 land use changes that I described. In total, there will be approximately 500 excess dwelling units generated by the Category 2 land use changes if the city approves them. Now, some of those sites in the Category 2 are located in the coastal zone. So units generated from those properties would not be available until the Coastal Commission approves those land use changes. However, there are properties outside the coastal zone where a Category 2 land use change is proposed that would generate approximately 312 excess dwelling units that the city could use in addition to the 891 that we currently have. Using the criteria we used for the Northeast Quadrant sites, we evaluated the properties in the rest of the city, and staff is recommending approval of the Aviara Farms property, to designate that property as R30. The La Casa Town Square property would be redesignated to R23. And then in the Ponto area, we're recommending that a portion of this area be designated at R23. And another portion, we would designate general commercial to allow for mixed-use development. The Ponto Beachfront Village Vision Plan identifies that a portion of the Ponto area would be developed as mixed use in the future. The city does not have a mixed-use designation or mixed-use zone. We utilize our commercial zoning and designations to authorize mixed-use development. Therefore, staff is recommending portions of the Ponto area to be designated as general commercial to allow for that mixed-use development. You'll see that there are two residential sites that we evaluated that we're not recommending approval of. One is the Ewa property that I mentioned earlier. We received a letter from the owner asking that that be withdrawn. The second site we are not recommending approval of is the Palomar Oaks West property. This is a site that's currently designated planned industrial and therefore has potential compatibility concerns and would represent a loss of employment land if it were changed to a residential use. There's one property, Marja Residential, that we evaluated. It did not make it to our list of recommended changes, but staff would support the land use change that we evaluated, subject to certain criteria that I'll mention in just a bit. But I do want to show you that with the sites that you see on the screen that are circled in green, the sites that staff is recommending approval of, without the Marja site, would require 858 dwelling units from the excess dwelling unit bank to be allocated to these properties. This table shows that if the staff recommended sites are approved, there would be a balance of 33 units in the bank, not counting the units that would be generated from the Category 2 land use changes. That balance is not enough to approve the Marja site. However, staff recommends or suggests that with two provisions, the council could support this land use change. If the property were required to develop at a minimum of 12 dwelling units per acre, the site could be included in the city's housing element sites inventory. Staff is recommending that to be eligible for an allocation from the excess dwelling unit bank as part of this process, that the site assists the city with meeting its housing element objectives. Therefore, that is one of the reasons why this site did not make it to the staff recommended list of sites. However, with a requirement of 12 dwelling units per acre minimum, the site could be considered as a site that may accommodate a moderate income housing in the future. Another provision is that the city would need to use some of those Category 2 excess dwelling unit banks that are generated to authorize this land use change to occur. You'll see on this table here that we currently have the 891 units in the bank. With the Marja site and the other staff recommended properties, we would need to withdraw 959 units. And that would be a deficit of 68 units. However, if you utilize some of the Category 2 excess units, we would still have sufficient units in the bank and a remaining balance after approval of the site changes. Some folks might be concerned that we are depleting the excess dwelling unit bank, and I'd like to mention that we anticipate that that bank balance will grow in the future. One source of excess units in the future will come from those Category 2 land use changes, in addition to the 312 that I've mentioned. In the coastal zone, those Category 2 land use changes would result in 191 excess dwelling units. Therefore, after the Coastal Commission approves those land use map changes, 191 units would be deposited into the excess dwelling unit bank. Another source of excess units will come from the approval and construction of future projects that are built at densities below the growth management control point. We have a number of projects in the city that are approved at densities below what's allowed by the growth management control point density. And once those projects are constructed, there will be up to another 437 units deposited into the bank. But they won't be deposited until those projects are constructed. Now, speaking of the excess dwelling unit bank, the City Council does have a policy related to that, which specifies the criteria that's required to authorize an allocation from the bank to a property or a project. The policy identifies that an allocation from the excess dwelling unit bank is considered an incentive for development on a piece of property, and in exchange for that incentive, the policy requires that the development of residential units comply with the city's inclusionary housing ordinance at a minimum, which requires a minimum of 15% of housing units built on the property to be affordable to lower-income households. The policy also states that the decision maker has the discretion to ask for a higher percentage of affordable housing or deeper affordability levels. And staff is recommending that in exchange for the allocation of units to the properties identified through this project, that a minimum of 20% of the units built on these sites be provided at a cost that's affordable to lower-income households. And in the staff report, attachment 4 is a draft resolution that would specify that requirement. And just real briefly, I want to describe some amendments that are proposed to the zoning ordinance and our local coastal program that are related to the draft general plan and the land use map changes that I just described. So we're also proposing to amend our zoning map and our local coastal program land use and zone maps to ensure consistency with the land use changes that are approved through this general plan update. And we're proposing amendments to our zoning ordinance text to change the minimum density for mixed use from 20 units an acre to 15 units an acre based on the formula that we use today. We're also recommending removal of references to what we call the RENA base density. This density was created when we, through the approval of our last housing element. It was the density we used to demonstrate to the state that we could meet our housing objectives for the previous housing planning period. With this draft housing element, we no longer need to use the RENA-based density. We're able to utilize the minimum density of the various density ranges to demonstrate to the state that we can comply with housing element law. Therefore, the RENA-based density is no longer needed. And we are also recommending that professional care facilities be permitted in the office zone with a conditional use permit. So that summarizes the zoning and local coastal program amendments. And the mapping changes that are proposed. And this concludes my portion of the presentation. I'd like to hand the mic over to David DeCordova, who will talk to you a little bit about the housing element.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Jesser. So this provides a nice segue to the next element of the general plan that we wanted to discuss with you this morning, and that's the draft housing element. As Ms. Jesser informed you earlier in her presentation, a number of the elements are required under state law, and the housing element is one of those. And the housing element also has some unique characteristics, even though in addition to being required required under state law, it is an area of great interest to the state of California. And the legislature many years ago declared that the availability of housing for every Californian is a statewide priority. And because of this, it's up to individual cities and counties to demonstrate that the community's housing needs can be accommodated. One of the key features of the housing element is that it, unlike other elements in the general plan, the housing element needs to be updated on a specific schedule, and that's set out by the state of California. And for the San Diego region, the housing element period is 2013 to 2021. So for planning purposes for the housing element, it's an 8-year cycle. For our general plan overall, it's more like a 20 to 25-year cycle. And then in addition to having to do an update once every 8 years, Carlsbad will be required to do a mid-cycle update to ensure that housing needs are continue to be accommodated. So 3 basic purposes of a housing element are to identify the current and future housing needs for Carlsbad residents. It's also to identify any barriers and opportunities that could be had in providing for housing. And then it's also, the housing element, a major feature of that is to establish programs to meet the community's needs. One of the most important components of the housing element is this provision we call the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. And this is a process that begins at the state level once every 10 years, where the state of California, through analysis, they come up with projections of what the population will be in the coming years. And then they allocate that population projection to the various parts of the state. And so for this part of the state, it's the San Diego region, so all 18 cities and the county of San Diego are expected to be able to accommodate for this housing element period up to almost 162,000 new dwelling units for this 8-year period. The next step in this projection and this allocation process is for the cities, and led by SANDAG, to determine the appropriate shares for each city in terms of how many units each city should plan for. And so for Carlsbad for this period, of that nearly 162,000 unit need for the San Diego region, Carlsbad's share is just under 5,000 units total. In addition to having this overall number that we need to plan for, we also need to plan for housing that can accommodate various income groups. And so those categories range from very low income to low, moderate, and above moderate income. And when we talk about the income groups, we're referring to where they fit relative to median incomes for the region. So for example, a very low income household will be earning approximately 50%, 50 to 60% of the regional median income. A low-income household would be 80%, moderate would be up to 120%, and so forth. So through the assessment and allocation process that's led by SANDAG, a number of factors are taken into account when determining how to allocate the share, and then also how to allocate those numbers by income group. Some of those factors include the land available for urban development within each of the jurisdictions, the extent to which there are constrained or protected lands, agricultural lands, the relationship of land use patterns to existing and future transportation systems, the availability of infrastructure, market demand, income distribution within each locality relative to the region, and so forth. So there's a whole host of factors that are considered when determining how these numbers should shake out. So in addition to the 5,000 units that we are required to plan for this planning period, we also have a share to accommodate approximately 1,600 units of very low and low income, and then another 1,000 units for moderate income, and then the balance of those could be accommodated for the other income level. So the key link here to the state requirement for providing for affordable housing and providing that housing by income level is the housing sites inventory. So we spent quite a bit of time this morning going over the residential chain sites and staff's recommendations, and that is in large part because of the need to have land use available at various densities to accommodate housing for the various income groups. So typically, providing for above moderate housing is less of a challenge as providing for housing for the lower and moderate and even moderate income groups. And under state housing law, the key there in terms of meeting affordability is density. So the idea is that the higher density lands can accommodate lower income, provide for lower income housing availability. So when we go through the process, we look at all the vacant lands and then underutilized lands. And when we're talking about underutilized lands, we're referring to properties that have some use on them, but maybe appropriate or looks like they could infill, expand, or even change use. And then of course, we also are looking at available vacant lands, whether it's currently designated for housing or not. So, and then again on the allowable densities, through our analysis, we've determined that moderate income housing can be supported with minimum densities of 12 units to the acre, and lower income densities at a minimum of 20 units to the acre. So as Ms. Jesser had mentioned earlier, most of the land use designations throughout the city do not change, and therefore they carry forward. So we have plenty of residential capacity, particularly in the lower density ranges. And then in addition to that, we have various areas of vacant land, underutilized land, areas that can be appropriate for mixed use, such as in the village, and let's see. And then the other piece is that the sites that have been identified through this Envision Carlsbad process, we are relying on to meet our housing needs. So this chart here shows how that breaks down. So at the top line, we identified projects that have been approved during this up to this point in the housing element period. We identified vacant land that's suitable for housing development, And then also the underutilized lands, those are areas in the village and in the barrio, for example. And then we total those up by income categories based on their densities. And then we look to check if we're meeting our regional housing needs in each of those categories. And in fact, this housing element is balanced and does provide for housing for those various income categories. So in addition to the housing sites analysis, the housing plan contains a number of programs. And these are programs that are ongoing in nature, and they do carry forward from our previous elements. And they are some of the types of programs that we're bringing forward are to preserve and improve existing affordable housing. These are programs for low-income owner rehabilitation programs, acquisition programs, and so forth. The other one is to maximize housing opportunities throughout the city. So we did talk quite a bit about that, making sure that we have adequate sites throughout the city. Also ensuring that we have the ability to provide for flexible development standards when needed. We have programs for inclusionary housing, as was mentioned earlier, density increases, and so forth. Then the third category of programs are to provide affordable housing assistance. That includes housing trust fund money that can be that the city can participate in providing for affordable housing, mortgage credit certificates, rental assistance programs, housing for the homeless, transitional supportive housing, and managed living units are other examples. The fourth set of programs aim to remove constraints. One of the technical parts of the housing element is to do an analysis of constraints to housing, both from a governmental or regulatory side and then also a non-regulatory side. So we have identified programs to help sort of additionally accommodate housing. And those, as I mentioned, include having flexibility in applying development standards and reasonable accommodation policy. And then finally, the final component is to promote fair housing. And we do that primarily through a contract with a fair housing service provider. So the housing element is also unique in that it does need to be reviewed by the state of California for consistency with the state housing element law. We did provide a draft back in September of 2014, and the Housing Community Development Department had reviewed the previous element, the draft element, and found that it was in compliance with housing element law. What we'll need to do once the City Council takes action to adopt this final housing element, we will send it up to the state for their final certification. I next want to talk about the mobility element because that is that's one of the elements that does carry some key features that sort of help us transition into this new area that Mr. New talked about at the beginning of his presentation. So the overall objective for the mobility element is what we call creating livable streets. And that really is to meet the mobility needs of all users of our streets, including pedestrians and including bicyclists, transit users, as well as vehicles. And it really is about providing for more mobility choices and options with an emphasis or shift in focus on moving people. When we look at the existing circulation element, this was adopted as part of the comprehensive general plan at the time. It's in 1994. The circulation element was really focused on building out the street network and the road system, and building and providing for automobile capacity. And it was also tied to growth management requirements to ensure that the construction of the roads did take place concurrent with new development, so that we were able to maintain good service levels for the road system. So why are we changing the focus now? The road network, for the most part, is complete. There are a few key sections that still need to be completed. I'll talk about that in a moment, but for the most part, our road system has been built. And then as the city nears build-out, we will shift our focus of circulation issues. We'll shift more towards protecting and enhancing the quality of life for our residents. It also relates to the community vision. So one of the core values that were identified was for biking, public transportation, and connectivity. So the core value there says to increase travel options through enhanced walking, bicycling, and public transportation systems, and enhance mobility through increased connectivity and intelligent transportation management. And then in addition to that, there is some state law that provides some guidance to cities on planning for their circulation system. In 2008, the legislature passed the Complete Streets Act, which says that when cities undertake updates to their circulation elements, they need to address the needs of all users. So the streets should be designed with all users in mind, including motorists, pedestrians, bicyclists, and children, persons with disabilities, also movers of commercial goods and public transportation. And so this livable streets approach that we're talking about, staff feels accomplishes that. It ensures that the streets serve all mobility needs of the users and will provide for a safe, attractive street environment that encourages use by pedestrians and cyclists in addition to cars. And it increases mobility choices that folks have said that they wanted. And it also links to another core value in the community vision as it relates to having a community that values recreation and active, healthy lifestyles. So some of the key features of the mobility element is the concept of shifting to a street typology system where the mobility element proposes a sort of a graduated approach to roadway solutions by considering the land uses served and the surrounding context. So the mobility element establishes street typologies that emphasize the preferred travel modes. So for example, the major arterials in the city, such as El Camino Real, Palomar Airport Road, College, Cannon, Melrose, give the automobile top priority. Other types of streets, residential streets, streets near schools, streets in the village, will have a focus on improving mobility for pedestrians and bicyclists. But in all cases, all modes of travel are provided for under the mobility element. Another feature of this mobility element relates to what we call level of service. This is something that many of us are in the planning profession are familiar with. We call it LOS, and that has for many, many years referred to providing level of service for the automobile. And this mobility element will actually expand that concept to establish level of service standards for the other modes as well. So the mobility element establishes standards for bikes, pedestrians, transit, as well as automobiles. And we know that even with the completion of the street system, certain exceptions under certain circumstances may be needed in order to balance the overall objectives of the mobility element. And this would occur at future dates and at the discretion of the City Council. So the mobility element does include a policy that recognizes that in some cases we may not be able to maintain level of service standards to the extent that we would desire to. So under certain circumstances, that is if the need to acquire additional right-of-way is not feasible, it would result in significant impacts to the environment or other community values, or would require the city to build out a road that's more than 6 travel lanes in width. then the mobility element suggests that exceptions could be made for those performance standards. Some of the sections of roadway that were identified in the mobility element, portions of El Camino Real from Palomar Airport Road to La Costa Avenue, 2 segments of Palomar Airport Road between I-5 and College, El Camino Real to Melrose, and then a section of La Costa Avenue between I-5 and El Camino Real are at some point in the future may exceed the level of service standard established in the mobility element, and the policy would provide for some exception to that. However, that's not to say that we don't do anything. First of all, such exceptions would not be considered until completion of the entire street network, and that means completing out Poinsettia Lane, for example, and College Boulevard. But it also means that instead of trying to widen our way out of congestion, that other techniques would be utilized. So, for example, maximizing the efficiency of the traffic signalization system and employing techniques to address the demand side of the equation, particularly as it relates to the peak hour commute times. So we call those transportation demand management techniques. So those would be implemented, applied to development in the future, and so forth. The mobility element also seeks to improve the safety and comfort for pedestrians and cyclists by completing missing sidewalks, making connections that have been identified, adding amenities, including furniture, street trees, and so forth. Also for enhancements to the transit system, most of which will be under the responsibility of our partner organizations, such as North County Transit District, but the mobility element identifies ways in which the city can assist and participate in that. These can include things like improving bus stop amenities, right? Sheltered bus stops, lighting, benches, and so forth. And then also through the city's land use authorities by encouraging transit-oriented development around the transit centers, for example. The mobility element also emphasizes ways to manage and reduce demand for the automobile. And this comes in the form of transportation demand management. As I mentioned a moment ago, these techniques include carpools, van pools, shuttles, focusing on what we call the first mile, last mile solutions to help get people from transit centers to their place of work and then back home. Alternative work schedules, telecommuting programs, things like that. And then also, of course, maximizing the efficiency of our transportation system through technology improvement, signal optimization, adaptive controls, and things like that. So as I mentioned before, the mobility element would have us complete the street system. There are 2 segments, Poinsettia Lane and College Boulevard, that will be built in the future. Cannon Road was another section of the unbuilt transportation system. This element would have Cannon Road not be extended eastward. Right now, it terminates at the high school. That missing link goes through a conservation area to link into the city of Oceanside. This mobility element would propose to delete that segment. And then, of course, to complete the bicycle, pedestrian, and trail system in the city. So we are currently in the process of updating our bicycle and pedestrian master plans and working on a trails master plan for the city as well. And then finally, there are policies that will address barriers of the freeway and the railroad, for example, by calling for improved connections across, either over or under some of those barriers. Okay, so that was it on the mobility element. And I want to talk about the climate action plan. This is a new component for the city. This will be our first climate action plan, as was mentioned earlier. It is not directly part of the general plan, but it is integrated, and it ties very closely to the general plan, particularly as it relates to land use and as it relates to mobility. And it also relates to the community's core values that was discussed earlier. So what I want to do is spend a little bit of time and talk about the climate action plan. I want to do just a little bit of background on climate change and why we're doing a climate action plan, and then kind of walk you through the components of the plan itself. So just a little bit of science. I'll be brief, I promise. So when we talk about climate change, we're talking about greenhouse gases. And greenhouse gases are those gases that are released into the atmosphere that trap heat radiating from the Earth's surface. And those gases direct the heat back to the Earth in a process known as the greenhouse effect. And I'm sure all of us are familiar with that term. And there are a number of heat-trapping gases, but the most common or the most abundant of it is carbon dioxide. But there are others. That includes water vapor, methane, nitrous oxide, and ozone, for example. And some of these gases occur naturally and are the result of natural processes, but other emissions are the result of human activities, which include the burning of fossil fuel for transportation, industry, and energy production. I'm going to talk about this slide to talk about the relationship of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and global temperatures. So we know that data collected on global greenhouse gas concentrations have demonstrated that the concentration of CO2 over the past 800,000 years have ranged somewhere between 180 and 300 parts per million of CO2. However, greenhouse gas emissions has increased dramatically since pre-industrial times, as shown in this figure here. Since 1800, greenhouse gases have gone from about 300 parts per million to about 350 parts per million in 1990, almost 380 parts per million in 2005. And then as of this June, the concentration of greenhouse gas emissions has exceeded 400 parts per million. It's now at about 403 parts per million. So the increased atmospheric concentrations of GHGs have led to a rise in average global temperatures due to the greenhouse effect that I described earlier. And this figure also shows, in that orange squiggly line there, that the increases in atmospheric CO2 and global temperatures, so this figure shows the CO2 and temperature rise from between 1880 and 2013. So when you look at the temperatures, they do fluctuate on a yearly basis, but you can clearly see that they generally trend upward in line with the increased concentrations of CO2. And we also know that except for 1998, the 10 warmest years since 1880 have actually occurred since 2000. And 2014 set a record globally as being the warmest on record to date. And scientists expect that this long-term temperature increase will continue as well. So this has impacts, both physical, ecological, and social impacts. On the physical side of temperature change, increased temperatures, of course, worldwide, more frequent extreme weather events, melting snowpack, glaciers and the ice caps, rising sea levels, ocean acidification. Ecological impacts as a result of climate change include greater risk of biodiversity loss and species extinction. And social impacts include, social and economic impacts include impacts to agriculture, forestry, fishery industries, impacts to water resources, energy, the financial services, insurance, to name a few. So given the impacts and the concerns of climate change, what has been the response? So this started at the state level in the mid-2000s. Started with a number of actions. I'm only going to highlight a couple of those. The first one that was key was the governor's executive order, S305. It was this is the order that established statewide targets. There were two that were established. One is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by the year 2020. And then the second and longer-term goal is to reduce emissions to 80% below 1990 levels by the year 2050. So that was an executive order issued by Governor Schwarzenegger when he was in office at the time, and that applied to state agencies and ordering them to develop plans to meet those targets. That was followed up a year later by the state legislature, which codified the first of those two goals, and this was AB 32, it's the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006. And in addition to sort of putting into law that first goal, it directed the State Air Resources Board to develop a plan. They call it a scoping plan, and a series of programs to meet the 2020 target. At about the same time, this is in the mid-2000s, the Attorney General's office became active in the area of climate change, and the Attorney General's office began reviewing cities and counties' updates to their general plans and began commenting on their general plans and letting cities and counties know that it was important that as part of the update process that they study the effects of greenhouse gas emissions, what new development's effect is on greenhouse gas emissions and the impacts to climate change. Courts also began to weigh in terms of various litigation related to specific development projects, and they began to find fault within project environmental reviews because they didn't properly analyze the impacts to climate change. So this all led to revisions in state law, the California Environmental Quality Act, or we call CEQA, and so it's now clear that under CEQA, environmental review is required. Projects need to analyze greenhouse gas emissions and project impacts contributing to climate change. And under CEQA law, general plan update is considered a project. So as part of the general plan update that is before you today, we are required to study the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions. The guidelines also state that cities can fulfill this requirement to study and plan for reducing greenhouse gas emissions by adopting a plan. We're calling it a climate action plan. They're also known as emission reduction plans or energy action plans. So what does all this mean for Carlsbad? Again, we'd say that doing a climate action plan aligns with community concerns for the environment and the high support that the community has for Carlsbad's sustainability element, or sustainability efforts, I should say. And then it relates to the general plan update. This is a good and necessary time to address it for the reasons I just stated. And then finally, it complements City Council's previously stated goals as well, their environmental guiding principles. Sorry. Oops. In 2007, the City Council adopted a set of environmental guiding principles, which, among other things, support efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the benefits of the Climate Action Plan, of course, it helps us comply with the law, help achieve state goals, defines a path for the city to do its share to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and then it also provides a clear and consistent way for future development projects to address greenhouse gas emissions, rather than every project having to do a separate analysis and come up with their own reductions measures. They can use the Climate Action Plan to do that. And that applies for developments on the private side, but then also for city-initiated projects as well. Okay, the next part I wanted to go through are the basic components of the plan. And this is as described in the CEQA guidelines, there are five parts to the plan, or 5 steps. First step is to quantify existing emissions. The next step is to establish our reductions targets, forecast of future emissions, develop measures to meet those targets, and then finally have a program to implement, monitor, and adjust as needed. So the first step, of course, was to conduct an inventory where the city estimated the emissions that are attributable to the community. We did one for 2005 and then updated that in 2011 in preparation for this climate action plan. We studied emissions from the various sectors of the community and found that the largest sources of emissions, of course, are transportation, which is nearly 40% of all emissions in Carlsbad are attributed to transportation. That's followed by the commercial and industrial sector of about 32%, and then residential 25%, and then lesser amounts as it relates to solid waste and wastewater. As I mentioned, we did do 2 inventories, one for 2005 and one for 2011, and that helps us establish a baseline and what we would call a sort of a business as usual trend line. So this graph here shows what the results of that inventory are. The numbers that you see there are measured, greenhouse gas emissions are measured in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So in 2005, it was approximately 630,000 metric tons, and then that increased to 705,000 by 2011. And that tracked pretty closely with population growth in Carlsbad over that period. The next step in the process is to establish reductions targets. Earlier, I talked about the statewide goals established by executive order and by law. So we use those to develop our targets. So we have a target to reduce to 1990 levels by the year 2020, and then the longer-term target, which is on the same trajectory to reach the 2050 target, but because our general plan only goes out to 2035, we do plan for a target to 2035. So it's on a straight line trajectory towards that longer-term 2050 target. So that straight line, trend line that I showed you in the previous slide, it doesn't account for a number of things that will affect emissions in the future. So we wanted to, in doing our projections, account for some of those activities. And these include a number of federal and state regulatory programs that will bring greenhouse gas emissions down in the future, and then also apply the city's general plan, mobility, and other policies that will also help bring greenhouse gas emissions down. So state and federal actions I won't go into in any detail, but those include requirements to increase renewable energy as part of the utilities portfolio when they're providing electricity. Is up to a third of the electricity that they provide to their customers must come from renewable resources. They have a target to reach that goal by 2020. In the San Diego region, I understand that SDG&E is very close to reaching that goal if they haven't already. There are other state and federal programs that are intended to increase the fuel economy for the vehicle fleet in California, and that will also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Programs to reduce the carbon intensity of fuel, and then also programs in the state's building code to require additional energy saving or energy efficiency in new construction. And then in addition to that, as I mentioned, the land use plan, the proposed general plan and mobility policies are factored into the projections for the future. So once we've done the modeling for that, that line now bends downward, and we can show that through that modeling that we can meet the 2020 target with the application of state and federal programs as well as general plan policies. After that, the line flattens out, and then it begins to bend upward again in the future, creating a gap where we would not be able to meet the longer-term 2035 target without employing additional measures. So the gap there shows about 134,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions that we would need to find savings by introducing additional measures. So that brings us to the fourth part of the Climate Action Plan, and those are the measures themselves. So the Climate Action Plan identifies 15 measures and over 40 distinct actions in total. And these measures are designed to address the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions, the transportation sector, building energy, and so forth. And then the measures, there are also measures to address city operations as well. So not only for the community, but for the city operations, we'll do our part to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So each of the measures in your Climate Action Plan has a quantified goal, a set of actions intended to meet that goal, and a reduction amount that is estimated to be achieved. It also includes an implementation timeframe, so the various measures will be implemented and carried out over time, and so we've got those categorized into short, mid, and long-term segments. So short-term, the first 2 years of implementation, mid 2 to 5 years, and then long-term implementation greater than 5 years. In addition, there's a qualitative assessment of the relative costs and benefits of implementing each measure, both to the private sector and then also to the city. And then many of the measures include identification of current incentive and assistance programs that are provided by the states and the federal governments and other organizations. So I won't go through all of the measures there, but I'll just briefly describe as examples of some of the measures that are identified in the plan. And those are for photovoltaic systems to increase the amount of photovoltaics that are used in the city. Energy efficiency retrofits, so that addresses the existing development throughout the city, and then also measures to improve the energy efficiency of lighting. On the transportation side, the implementation of transportation demand management to really encourage folks to use other ways of getting around rather than the solo occupant vehicle. So we're trying to reduce the total vehicle miles traveled, also to increase vehicle miles traveled by zero and low emission vehicles. And then also there are measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are related to the distribution and transmission of water utilities. So once we put all of the measures that we've identified in there and estimate what the reductions are, we show that we can meet that longer term goal, 2035. And that's what this slide here shows. The final part of the Climate Action Plan is the implementation piece. There are a number of actions to actually carry out this measure. One of the things that is important for any climate action plan is that it needs to have some enforceability to it. So the city is proposing, or will come back at a later date with ordinances that address energy conservation, both for the residential and the commercial sectors, and then also a transportation demand management plan for the city, and then a transportation demand management ordinance. So those will be some key pieces of implementation. And then in addition to that, education is also important. So almost all of the measures that are in there have some education or awareness component to that. And the city will use its communications resources to increase awareness of and encourage taking action to reduce the carbon footprint. and promote city and other programs and incentives as we develop them over time. The city will also build the administrative capacity necessary to implement the Climate Action Plan. And finally, I wanted to point out, during the public review of this CAP, we did make a number of revisions to the Climate Action Plan. And that was, so some of the changes were to include strengthening the monitoring and reporting components to it. So in addition to the two primary targets, we did establish some interim target years so that we can check and see how we're doing and how we're progressing. So we added interim target years for the year 2025 and the year 2030. And then we also identified preliminary metrics to assess the effectiveness of each of these measures as we implement them. We will also be providing a public report to the City Council on an annual basis to let you know how we're doing in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And then every 3 years, we will update the emissions inventory. And then that way we can check and see if we're actually achieving what we had hoped to achieve. So by having this regular monitoring and feedback mechanism in place, it will allow the city to respond to changes in circumstances and then adapt the plan accordingly. So that's what I had on the Climate Action Plan. I'm now going to turn it over to Don to talk about the Environmental Impact Report.
Thank you, Dave. So our final part of the presentation is the Environmental Impact Report, and I'm not going to spend a great deal of time going through it in detail, but just wanted to point out some of the significant portions. So the EIR was prepared pursuant to the requirements of the California Environmental Quality Act. It did evaluate the environmental impacts associated with all development allowed by the proposed general plan, and it considered the other actions that are before both the Planning Commission and the City Council. It is a program level analysis, as these aren't specific development projects at this time. As we discussed earlier in the presentation, we did have requirements and opportunities for community input, and these included a 60-day review period of the draft EIR, a 45-day review period of the recirculated draft, which were 2 sections that were sent out. And then as a result of these comment periods, we did receive over 300 comment letters. And when these individual letters were analyzed, they provided over 1,700 individual comments. There were 2 significant and unavoidable impacts that were identified through the EIR, and these were to the areas of air quality and transportation. So as a result of that, you do have, as part of the items for consideration, the findings of fact and the statement of overriding considerations because of these 2 significant and unavoidable impacts. And then lastly, there is a mitigation monitoring and reporting program included. The final EIR itself consists of the draft plus a number of additional chapters, and here on the screen we've noted Chapter 2 is the comment letters received and the detailed responses to each comment letter. We also have revisions to the draft EIR and the recirculated draft that are contained in Chapter 3, and then Chapter 4 would contain revisions to the draft general plan as a result of comments received and the work in the EIR, and the same would hold true for Chapter 5, the Draft Climate Action Plan. So then in summary, I just wanted to briefly go through the items that are part of the project. We started off the presentation with these. So throughout this project, the Commission and the Planning Commission will be considering a request to certify the EIR, to approve the draft general plan as revised, approve the draft climate action plan as revised, also approving an amendment to the circulation performance standard and the citywide facilities improvement plan, grant the allocation of units from the excess dwelling unit bank for the sites that were described earlier. We had the limited zoning ordinance amendments that were also mentioned, and then the zoning map and coastal program land use changes are part of the coastal program amendment. As the mayor mentioned at the beginning of the meeting today, our purpose is to receive public comment on the project. After that public comment, staff will be here to respond to those comments. We would expect the council then would adjourn, and the Planning Commission, we will continue to a date certain so it can begin its deliberations on the actions. I did want to conclude our staff presentation and note that we did provide to both the commission and the council a series of comment letters that were received in the last couple of days. So those are provided at your table. These were comments that were submitted very recently, and we can address those later in the proceedings. So with that, I would conclude our staff presentation.
Thank you, Don and staff, for that report. Now that the staff presentation has concluded, we will begin public testimony. On the plan, the general plan does not address any specific development projects. If you would like to address a specific project, such as the 8515 plan, there will be a public comment period after the public hearing on the general plan. We have a lot of speakers today. We want to be sure that everyone has the opportunity to speak. We would like to ask you to hold your time to 3 minutes. So I think if you look around the room, there's approximately 200 people in the room today. And if we want to conclude by 5 o'clock, you're all pretty good with math. If not, I would ask you to revert to your phones to figure out what that divides by. Again, this is your moment, time to speak. We want you to be professional. We want you to be courteous to one another. We have a timer up on the podium that will give you green when you start. That's 3 minutes. Yellow will be at 1 minute. And at red, I probably am going to be a little short, meaning I would ask you to please allow the next person to speak. So again, this is out of professional courtesy. The other thing is time is valuable. So applause or clapping, I would ask you not to do that and just be respectful. So with that, I think we will just take a moment, 5 minutes, for everybody who's been here since the beginning to stand up and stretch a minute. And at exactly 11:15, we will start. Those of you who want to speak and are representing 4 or more speakers, we will hear you first. You will need to bring your speaker cards up, and you will line up to the left over here to be heard. With that, we'll take 5 minutes.